Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the program. The Pro Wrestle Machine is back with another chapter from Roddy Piper's book, Through the Use of the Pro Wrestle Machine, In the Pit with Piper, by Roddy Piper. Chapter 7. The New York Years. After getting the news from Crockett that McMahon wanted me in New York, I went home to my wife and daughter and said, "Honey, we're going to New York." Kitty gave me one of those "you have to be kidding me" looks, but she never uttered a bad word about having to relocate again. She just rolled with the punches and trusted my judgment. No matter what, Kitty always gave me her full support. I wanted to give my wife and baby everything they deserved, and New York had a lot to offer. I was well aware of Frank Sinatra's advice in the song New York, New York, that if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. And I was determined to prove that I had what it took. I was also just so in love with my daughter Anastasia, who reminded me of Shirley Temple, that I wanted her to have the best life had to offer. So if it meant packing our bags and going to New York and starting over, I was prepared to do it. At this point in our lives, Kitty was used to the craziness. My wife had been through a lot with me already, so another move wasn't that big a deal. Bob Orton had once told me to drink apple cider vinegar every day because it was good for my joints. Well, I drank half a bottle of cider vinegar every night for 6 months straight, and nothing. If Kitty could live with me coming to bed smelling like a salad every night for half a year, I'm sure she could handle New York. Poor Kitty, the crazy shit I put her through. I'll also never forget the one night in Charlotte when some insane fans found out where we lived and came to our apartment and tried to harass us. It was about midnight. The baby was asleep and Kitty and I were lying on the bed, talking and cuddling. All of a sudden we heard this hootin' and hollerin'. I got up and went to the window. Our apartment looked out onto a parking lot, and there I saw 2 pickup trucks filled with North Carolina rednecks. They were circling the lot with their brights on, honking their horns and shouting, "Hey Piper, we know you're in there. Come on out. We'll kick your ass." I'd always been a lone wolf, but now I realized I wasn't on my own anymore. I had a wife and a child. I was now a father, and this was all pretty new to me, so my first reaction as Father of the Year was to overreact. I happened to be packing 2 guns in the house at the time, so me, Smith, and Wesson went outside to see what these punks wanted. I ran out the door, without even buttoning up my jeans, my .357s in hand, and I just began shooting. Those rednecks turned white, just like Casper the Ghost, and scrambled to get out of there. But I just kept running and shooting, hoping to nail one of the bastards. Just when I had one of the trucks in my sight, my jeans fell to my ankles, causing me to do a perfect nosedive square onto the concrete. I fell flat on my face, scraping the dog out of my nose and knees. I looked up just in time to see the taillights of those trucks hightailing out of the lot. Kitty came outside and sauntered up to me ever so calmly. She found me lying face down on the ground with my pants down and both guns still in my hands, and she said very quietly, "Are you finished, Roderick? Do you think we can go back into the apartment now, sweetheart?" I asked her to hold the guns as I pulled my pants up, and we went back inside like nothing happened. This is why I love Kitty so much. She takes me for who I am and allows me to be myself. But the key word is Roderick coming out of her mouth. The minute she uses my full name, I know she means business. If it comes from anyone else, it won't work, only from Kitty. She has saved my life so many times over the course of our relationship that I've lost count. Kitty has been putting up with my shit not only from our first date in the park, but also from our first day as man and wife. In 1982, we got married one afternoon in Portland in an old Scottish church, and not only didn't we go on a honeymoon afterward, but I left her alone on our wedding night to go wrestle in a match. To this day we still haven't gone on a honeymoon. When it was time to leave for New York, we packed up our car and hitched a U-Haul trailer to the back of the Cadillac and said goodbye to Charlotte. After making the straight drive, we finally hit New York, and of course I kept with my tradition of letting a new city know that I was in town. I opened up my window and yelled, "New York City, Roddy Piper is here and I'm gonna kick your ass." My wife looked at me strangely. This was the first time that anyone had been in a car with me when I did this. The first thing Kitty, Anastasia, and I did was try to find some place to live. Instead of living in the heart of all the craziness of New York City, we decided to look around in New Jersey, which is far enough away from the hustle and bustle but close enough that you could still feel the city's pulse. After driving around a bit, we settled for a small hotel right on the ocean in Seabright, New Jersey. After what was about to happen to me and my family, you would think I would remember the name of the place, but I guess deep down I'm just trying to forget. Once we got settled in the room, I called a couple of people to find out when and where I was wrestling, and then I was off to work. I began wrestling all over New York and New Jersey with people like Sergeant Slaughter, Don Morocco, and Mr. Fuji, who also lived in the New Jersey area. Almost immediately I was back to wrestling regularly and keeping crazy hours. One particular night I got home from the matches around 1:30 a.m. and everyone was sound asleep. I was also dead on my feet, so I cuddled in bed with Kitty, thinking I was in for a long night's rest. With our room being right on the water, the sound of the ocean waves, plus the fact that I hadn't stopped a lick since we got to town, knocked me right out. 2.5 hours later, Kitty was frantically trying to wake me up. As soon as I heard her crying, it got my attention and heart racing and I jumped right out of the bed. When my bare feet hit the floor I realized that our entire room was flooded with 3 to 4 inches of water, with more coming fast and furious. My heart began racing even more when my thoughts shifted to the whereabouts of my baby girl, who was usually sleeping in her playpen that was now floating across the room. As the freezing seawater awoke me fully, I found Kitty had already rescued Anastasia and placed her safely in her Moses basket on top of the dresser. Thank God she was safe. I quickly gathered my family and went right for the door, and you wouldn't believe the amount of water that just poured in when I opened it. The force almost knocked me off my feet, so it was a good thing that Kitty was behind me holding the baby. When we got outside, there was probably about 1.5 feet of water, so my first priority was to get my family up to higher ground. After doing this, I made my way back to our car, which was parked outside our room, only to find that the front doors of the vehicle were already submerged. Knowing that there was no way for me to move it, I proceeded to unhook the U-Haul trailer so I could get it to safety because it had all of our valuables in it, including a mason jar with all the money we had in the world. I still did not believe in putting my money in the bank, so now I had the unfortunate pleasure of pulling this humongous trailer out of harm's way by these 2 huge chains, by myself, like Hercules. Using every muscle and ounce of strength I had, I managed to get the damn thing to higher ground, away from the shoreline. A couple of our things wound up getting ruined, like one of my wife's favorite collectible horse pictures, that still has the water stains on it to this day, as it hangs on our wall. But all in all, most of our stuff was okay. As I was pulling the trailer, I could hear the National Guard calling out to the people on the loudspeaker, warning them about the flood and also offering to help take everyone out of the storm and to safety. They picked up my wife and Anastasia and put them in the front of the truck, and later on I caught up to them and jumped in the back. We were then taken to a local school gymnasium for shelter, and as soon as I knew Kitty and the baby were safe and dry, I hit the road to try to find us a new place to live. After searching for a couple of hours, I finally got us a room for the month at the local Hilton, but before I gave them any money, I made sure the room was on the 15th floor. While I was gone, one of the New Jersey newspaper reporters came by the shelter and took a picture of my soaking wet wife and my baby sitting in a chair. The next morning when we woke up nice and dry in our hotel, we were hit with another shock. I ordered us breakfast from room service, and with our order came the morning newspaper. To our surprise, on the front page is a photo of my wife and daughter that said destitute family. Well, Kitty was clever enough to give the reporter Sergeant Slaughter's real family name so as to not draw attention to us, but it gave us the good laugh we needed after the ordeal we just had been through. I even teased Kitty that morning, saying, "Who would have guessed that you would be on the front page of a paper in New Jersey before me?" Now we have 2 celebrities in the family. After breakfast, I went back to our flooded hotel to try to fish out our car, and within a few hours I had dumped all the water from the soaked interior and had it up and running. But the Cadillac was never quite the same after the flood, and it eventually blew up a few months later, at which time I left it on the side of the road and never saw it again. After our 30-day stay at the Hilton, we settled into an apartment in Woodbridge, New Jersey, where Don Morocco lived. Don and I even got to experience one of the most important days in the world of pro wrestling together. We were in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, for an event that would make history. Vince McMahon Sr. had decided that he and his son were going to take over the world. He called me personally and told me that I was the chosen one. He said he had big hopes for me, but he wanted to make sure that I wasn't afraid to work against any other promoter. I had no problem with this, but like I said before, little did I know that Vince Sr. had the same conversation with every other top renegade in the nation. So we all were called into Harrisburg. It was like a who's who of wrestling. There were about 25 guys here: Paul Orndorff, Jimmy Snuka, George the Animal Steele, Mr. Fuji, Andre the Giant, Adrian Adonis, Jesse Ventura, David Schultz, Ken Patera, Sergeant Slaughter, and all these other rebels. It was first thing in the morning and we had all just come off the road from wherever we were, and no one had any idea why they were calling a meeting. We were hungover, tired, rode hard, and miserable. All we knew was it was 10 o'clock in the morning, and we had to do interviews that day and wrestle 3 times later that evening. So everyone was doing whatever they had to do to come alive, chugging a pot of coffee, dancing on a mountain in Peru. Andre's got his wine. Mr. Fuji is sitting over there eating his garlic. All of a sudden Vince McMahon Sr. and Jim Barnett come into the room, and we're all standing around trying to figure out what's going on. They asked us all to find a seat and sit down, like we were in school or something, and that just set some guys off. I really don't think they realized how pissed the guys were. They even took Andre the Giant away from his bottle of wine, which was like flirting with death. What the hell were they thinking? Anyway, after an hour of their begging and pleading for us to sit down, the 25 gorillas all took a seat. We were now all ears, and wanted to know what the heck they wanted. Then they brought in some puny guy, announcer, whose name was Vince McMahon Jr. He stood between Vince Sr. and Barnett. What a power play, so they thought. What were they trying to do, fucking intimidate us? They sat 25 top guys down thinking we'd be eager to hear what they had to say, but they were wrong. We were all established stars who had proven our drawing power over the years and who could get jobs anywhere. The McMahons and Barnett were shitting in their pants as we sat there with "What the fuck do you want?" looks on our faces. Vince Sr. had a habit of shaking quarters in his hand, and let me tell you, those quarters were going a mile a minute that day, because I think he realized that we were all onto his "you're the chosen one" bullshit. And Barnett was no better, as he frantically stood in front of us in his Armani suit, smelling his tie and looking around for the nearest exit. They then proceed to tell us that Vince Jr., some freaking announcer, was going to open the orders. Well, we all wanted to know what fucking orders they were talking about, because if it was for breakfast, we all could have gone for a nice steak with some eggs at that moment. Vince begins the meeting by saying, "Thank you all for coming. I guess you all know why we are here." And immediately Dr. David Schultz says, "Yeah, we're here to wrestle. What the fuck are you here for?" McMahon Jr.'s face turned beet red, and Sr. was shaking his quarters faster and faster. Barnett, that little troll, just kept sniffing the shit out of his tie. We saw the fear in their faces. They were like 3 deer caught in the headlights. They had 25 gorillas in one room, and they had forgotten to bring the bananas. And at that moment we knew we had them. It was a moment of triumph. For the first time the wrestlers were driving the Greyhound. We knew we had the promoters backed against the wall. There was nothing they could do. What were they going to say? McMahon Jr. cut short his speech and asked if anyone had any questions. The room was silent. You could feel the tension, and we could feel the power that we had. But then Tony Atlas, a big and strong black wrestler, broke the silence when he raised his hand and said, "Excuse me, Mr. McMahon, I got a question. You see, Mr. McMahon, every night I see Arnie Scallard, and I get me in advance. At the end of the week when I get my paycheck, my check ain't that big." The room was again quiet, and Don Morocco slowly turned to Atlas and said, "You stupid asshole." At this time, let's give credit where credit is due. MC Mahan Jr. seized the moment. He said to Atlas, "Well, you see, Tony, I know you guys are wrestlers, but 3 minus 1 is 2, and 2 minus 1 equals 1. So you see, as you take it away, it gets smaller and smaller." He's talking to us like we were a bunch of fucking kindergartners. For 3 glorious seconds we had been triumphant. There was a feeling of solidarity in that room, and we finally were getting the respect we thought we deserved. We had conquered the promoters. Until Tony Atlas asked the magic question and McMahon rolled with it. Senior's quarters started shuffling a little slower, Barnett stopped sniffing his tie, and the red left Junior's face. We were now on equal ground again. We also found out that memorable day that the 3 men not only wanted us to wrestle only for them in New York, they also wanted to lock us all down by having each of us sign contracts so we would be able to work only for them. Well, after my last contract experience in Atlanta, I wasn't about to sign my name on the dotted line for anyone, and I wasn't the only one who felt this way. No one wanted to sign a contract and give away their rights to wrestle elsewhere. But the guys eventually gave in and signed on with Vince. I was the very last wrestler to sign, and that's only because I had no other choice, which you'll learn about later on in this book. In his conspiracy to take over the world, Vince McMahon Jr. was making a very smart and ruthless move, and only a few of us caught on to his real intentions. He wanted to corner the market, and the first thing he needed to do was sign all the best in the biz. What he was really trying to do was establish a brand A federation that was bigger than the individual stars who wrestled in it. Normally, when we were in an arena, the billboard outside showcased the talent that was going to wrestle that night, such as Roddy Piper versus Hulk Hogan, and that would be what attracted the people. But McMahon slowly changed the billing on the marquee to highlight the WWF instead of putting our names there. While our names were still drawing record crowds, McMahon was trying to make it look like it was the WWF name and not the wrestlers that was bringing in the fans. Eventually, of course, the WWF name had all the power, and with the wrestlers losing the top billing, McMahon could now pay them much less. It was now the WWF coming into town as opposed to whatever the main event was. But let's get something clear, folks. McMahon did not make the WWF, the wrestlers did. The suits didn't realize that it wasn't going to be easy keeping 25 stars happy all the time. It was one thing for a promoter to keep the ego of one superstar under control, but when all of a sudden you've got a bunch of wrestling rebels from all over the globe in one room, sharing one pie, you've got problems, especially when each guy was promised that he was going to be the main draw. On any given evening you never knew who was going to explode. At each event, we would sit around in the dressing room waiting for someone to snap. Adrian Adonis, Macho Man Randy Savage, the Iron Sheik, Tony Atlas, Mr. Fuji, and countless others, we all took our turns letting off some steam in front of our peers. Before the WWF and WCW came into existence, wrestling was a sport that was very territorial. Back then there was a definite respect for one another's well-being in the ring and the territory you wrestled in, and if you didn't respect either rule there were consequences. The same held true for the promoters and their promotions. You just didn't invade somebody's region. McMahon had visions of entering other guys' territories and cornering the market of the wrestling world. That's why he brought in all the best from the different areas around the country. He had a vision of an organization that reached out way beyond the tri-state area, and he figured if he had the best wrestlers locked up under contract to him, no one in the sport would be able to match his product. But none of us wanted to double-cross any of the promoters we were tight with in other states. Again, we had no idea where this was leading, and we wanted to protect our contacts in the wrestling world. Over the years I've seen wrestlers and promoters get hurt badly when they were caught crossing the lines. There were very strong ethics inside the dressing room. Rules, such as you never went into another guy's bag, his poke, for any reason. Even if you needed a brush and you saw one sticking out of another guy's poke, you never went over and just grabbed it. A guy's personal property was his and his alone, and if a wrestler violated the steadfast rule, he would face a stiff punishment. When it came to our livelihood, we weren't very tolerant or forgiving, especially to our own. We should have known better. One time, unbeknownst to us, there was a thief in our room who had been stealing money from us for about a month, but no one caught wind of it because he was a smart thief. He would take only a little cash at a time while the guys were out wrestling in the ring. For example, one time a guy was talking out loud to himself, saying, "I thought I had $100 here and there's only 80. Another night, some wrestler said, "Geez, I could have sworn I had $400, and he only had $300. Stealing was probably the worst thing a wrestler could do because we all were already aware that we were being ripped off by the promoters. But this thief wasn't smart enough to fool everybody. Having been around the sport for so long, the late great Gorilla Monsoon and the elders in our room suspected something was going on without saying a word to any of us. They put out some bait to catch the rat. One night Monsoon put a special invisible solution on some money that he left hanging out of his pocket, hoping the thief would strike. Even though none of us knew about it, the elders' plan worked to perfection, as the thief did indeed go for the bait, and stole the money from Gorilla's pocket. When he went into the shower to get cleaned up, his dirty deed was uncovered as his hands turned beet red once the water hit them. And after a few seconds, water wasn't the only thing hitting this prick. The undeniable lie detector test revealed who the culprit was, and the elders immediately pummeled him in the shower and laid him out bare naked in his stall. After they were through giving him the beating of his life, which left him unconscious, the elders turned on all the hot water heads and left the thief there to bake. Justice is swift and decisive in the wrestling world. Let's just say that he not only almost lost his life that night in the shower, he also lost his right to wrestle on any pro circuit. We just didn't take too kindly to people who were stopping us from feeding our families. From that moment on, this particular wrestler was blackballed from the sport and, to my knowledge, never wrestled in another city again. Speaking of other cities, Vince McMahon Jr. thought he had the right to make us wrestle any place that he booked us because he was paying us well, not well enough, but it's easier to get fucked big, even if it meant stepping into another promoter's territory. This would cause problems for both McMahon and the wrestlers. One of the problems that McMahon had was in Charlotte, which was run by the Jimmy Crockett, a territory I was all too familiar with. There had always been a line drawn in Richmond, Virginia, between Virginia and Washington, very Civil War-ish. This line was very much respected over the years and no one really ever tried to cross it. Except McMahon, that is. The New York promoter tried to go and run against Jimmy Crockett in Charlotte, and once I saw this, I told McMahon that I wouldn't work against Crockett or Don Owens. Again, I had no contract or guarantee at that particular time, So I wasn't just going to burn any bridges for Vince McMahon or anybody else. But I also had to be realistic. The business was changing, and if I wanted to earn a living in pro wrestling, I had to change with the times. Sure, it went against who I was and what I stood for to work in a territory of someone who at one time in my career helped me out, but I still had to put food on the table for my wife and kids. But I have to hand it to him, Vince always finds a way to get things done if he really wants it that bad. One way Vince was able to get around the territory politics was to have a benefit event in the area for a wrestler named Rick McGraw, who had just recently passed away. I had the pleasure of wrestling against Rick in his very last match. The benefit took place in Charlotte, with all the proceeds going to McGraw's family, and while it was a nice gesture to help a fallen colleague's family in their time of need, it was really more about breaking the wrestling boundary line. It was a way for McMahon Jr. to move in on Jimmy Crockett, and once he crossed that line, there was no stopping him. He was ready to make the world of wrestling his own, and no territory was off limits. But even though he wanted to own all the territories in the States, McMahon was still too cheap to pay for all our traveling expenses. We would only be flown to events if they were more than 300 miles away. For example, if we were wrestling some events in Ohio, he would fly us into the first city, say, Cincinnati, and then we had to drive to the other cities on that tour. He wanted to get the most bang for his buck without having to go into his pocket for anything extra. Speaking of extra, McMahon now also had us doing some promotional work for our upcoming matches in the cities where we were working. While I didn't mind helping promote the sport in our matches and interacting with the fans, I did mind that people were going to try and make us look like buffoons. There was one time in Cincinnati when I was wrestling in the main event against Hulk Hogan. I was told that I was going to be presented with an award from the mayor of the city before my match. So that night, just before I was ready to go on, I put on my kilt and belt and wet myself down. I draped a bath towel around my neck and made my way to the ring, ready to fight. The arena was packed. Wrestling had really taken off at this point in time and everybody wanted to get in on the action, even the mayor of Cincinnati. When I got into the ring, there was the mayor, supposedly the youngest mayor ever, and he grabbed the mic and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have an award for Roddy Piper, the biggest cheater and lowlife wrestler in the business." The mayor went on and on, hurling insult after insult at me. I immediately took offense, not only at what he was saying, but also at how he was demeaning my sport. I wasn't about to let anyone diss my sport, not even a mayor. I grabbed the towel from around my neck, folded it in half, and started beating the living shit out of the guy. I kept hitting him over the head so hard that he finally fell out of the ring. This mayor was trying to make me look like some kind of cartoon character. He thought wrestling was phony and wrestlers were just a bunch of buffoons. He didn't realize that he was in the ring with a real-deal pro wrestler who never took a back step from anybody. At first everyone couldn't believe what I was doing, but as soon as the mayor hit the floor, a group of policemen ran to help him up. They looked like they wanted to arrest me and the fans were irate. But I had a match to wrestle. Out came Hogan and I picked up on him where I left off with the mayor. I thoroughly trounced him. Now the fans were really going wild. They were screaming and throwing things at me. I had just beaten up their mayor and pummeled their favorite hero right before their eyes. However, now I had a problem. It was 30 feet from the ring to the locker room and I had to walk through a horde of furious fanatics to get there. The police certainly weren't going to protect me after what I did to their mayor, and I literally had to fight for my life just to get back to the dressing room. But this just goes to show you that Roddy Piper isn't afraid to show anyone just how real he and his sport are, even if it means beating up some prepubescent mayor in front of 10,000 of his people. Despite these little run-ins with people who thought they could make us look stupid, our sport at the time was rising in popularity faster than ever. We were in demand all over the country and McMahon had us traveling and working a crazy schedule. At that time, as a testament to Morocco and Snuka's talent, the WWF had the weight of its business on their shoulders. Snuka and Morocco were selling out venues nightly. But Vince thought that Hulk Hogan was everything a wrestler should be, big and muscle-bound. Vince fell in love with him as a top draw, and the Hulkster grabbed hold of the opportunity and ran with it. The two started scheming about how they were going to take over the wrestling world by killing off all the other top wrestling talent in New York. The decision to use Hogan as the chosen one was made. Vince Sr. was riding high with wrestlers such as Bob Backlund, Jimmy Snuka, and Don Morocco, but Jr. had made a pact with Hogan. Vince Jr. and Hogan had a plan, but there was one obstacle. The problem, folks, was very simple. Jimmy Snuka had put 25 years of blood, sweat, and tears into professional wrestling along with an unusual amount of talent and a body God must have chiseled himself. The fans were infatuated with the mystique of Superfly. This was making it impossible for Vince Jr. to carry out his plan of making Hulk Hogan the ultimate fan favorite. Of course, no one's denying that Hogan played a major role in catapulting wrestling to the height of its popularity in the 80s. But people fail to realize that although Hulkamania was running wild at the time, he was usually running from Roddy Piper. Yes, Hogan played his say your prayers and take your vitamins role perfectly, but it still wasn't enough to gain the #1 spot over the Super Fly. Junior still had to achieve his goal. So this is what Junior did, and I'll let you folks make up your minds. He promoted a cage match to take place in Madison Square Garden in October 1983. The cage match had such quality to it that people still talk about Snuka and his cage dive to this day. It was one of the biggest moments in WWF history. McMahon heavily publicized this match, and he even talked Superfly into this upcoming finish. This is exactly how it went, folks. At the 15-minute mark in the cage match, Snuka body slams Morocco. Snuka heads for the turnbuckle corner. As he starts climbing, cameras are flashing in anticipation of Snuka doing his patented dive. The entire garden was standing waiting for this beautifully executed move. Superfly, being the pro he was, didn't stop at the turnbuckle. He climbed to the top corner of the 30-foot cage. With each step he took upward, the fans were in awe. Jimmy continued climbing to the top of the cage and stood barefoot and erect, lovingly panning the crowd at MSG as they were exploding with excitement. He bends his knees and swan dives 35 feet down, directly onto his target, Don Morocco, and hits him perfectly. The ref dives down with a 1 count. I have never seen MSG so electrified in my life. Then the ref gives a 2 count and Morocco kicks out. Snuka ended up losing this match because Morocco got out the cage door. Now, McMahon has made room for Hogan. Little did everyone know that Hogan was popping vitamins like M&Ms in order to try and keep up with me on the mat. Vince Sr. and Jr. never expected Roddy Piper to be able to rival their new chosen son. I mean, out of the 25 top dogs, I was the smallest. I didn't have any angles. I didn't have the office behind me. All I had was what my forefathers taught me and what I had learned from my wars in the ring. But that was enough to get me over. This is the end of this chapter. Make sure to like and subscribe. See you next time.